Hermann Gunkel, regarded as one of the greatest biblical scholars of his time, grew up and was educated in the late 19th century. His research was primarily published in the early 20th century. Gunkel developed form criticism, focusing on the setting in life of various narrative and poetic forms in Israel. His works were translated into Hebrew by the Bialik Institute in 1998. Legends of Genesis and Biblical Literature, including appraisal articles by Prof. Zeev Weissman and Alexander Rofe. Since Gunkel's research assumes that the Torah was not composed as a work reflecting actual events, he takes care to establish this assumption with several introductory pillars, including a passionate essay on how the Torah describes all sorts of miracles, prophecies, and conversations with God, which would be childish to believe actually happened, concluding that these matters do not suit a modern and enlightened reader. As typical of early 20th century scholarship, the theological question is not up for debate. There's no attempt to disprove the religious argument upon which the Torah is based. Rather, it's assumed to be non-existent since it's deemed impossible. This assumption itself serves as a kind of definitive proof that some alternative critical theory needs to be invented. Given the foundational assumption that the Torah does not represent a record of events, there's a need, as mentioned, to invent an appropriate background for the genesis of the large amount of material. Gunkel does so with great poetic flair, creating various imaginary settings that he believes were the original foundations for the Torah's stories, establishing different criteria for precedence and succession. All these divisions are unsupported by any evidence or semblance of proof. They are the product of Gunkel's intuition, almost entirely without recourse to any real parallel testimony or sign. The category of proofs is not utilized, and there's no need for them in such studies. At some point, he explains why he blindly relies on the accepted division of sources. The distinction between these three sources of the book of Genesis is the result of 150 years of research in biblical science. Since the existence of Protestant biblical science, contentious issues in Genesis received special treatment, and this work was undertaken with diligence, acuteness, and discernment worthy of admiration. Consequently, a project has emerged that is certainly a pride for future generations. Today, the reliability of the sources can be determined almost to the word. The reader might think this represents some foundational methodological difference that can be substantiated. Yet the term bag appears in the Torah only in Joseph's story, and it's unclear that it's the same as a sack. Even if so, is it conceivable to imagine separate schools of thought where one of the main differences is how to call a sack? One source narrates that Isaac was deceived because of the smell of the garments, and the other because of his blindness. Is it necessary to address this trivial difference, suggesting that a seeing person could mistake his sons by scent, if not because he was blind? And even the blind need factors to base their mistake on, as they can distinguish through hearing, touching, smelling. Gunkel's foundational assumption is that oral compositions are inherently short and simplistic, writing, "The ancient narrators were not capable of creating more comprehensive artistic works, and to the same extent, they could not expect their audience to listen attentively for days and weeks. In ancient times, they were satisfied with very short works that did not last more than a quarter of an hour. At the end of the story, the listener's capacity for absorption was exhausted. At most, they wished to hear it again." The limited absorption capacity of the listeners led to the stories being designed in a clear and easy-to-understand manner. There is no basis for the existence of these ancient narrators. Long written works were composed much before the giving of the Torah, such as the Harris Papyrus measuring 42 meters of text, and certainly not for their intellectual limitations or the listener's inability to engage with long and complex stories for days and weeks. Gunkel is so entrenched in his imagination that he sets a quarter-hour limit for each story. Yet we know of several ancient cultures where long and complex texts were transmitted orally, such as the Iliad and the Odyssey, the Vedas, and more. See also in Prof. Weissman's article, printed as an introduction to Gunkel's book, P5. There's quite a bit of naivety in his descriptions of the primitive creative house and the audience incapable of absorbing a long story, especially when he attributes this cultural activity to a primordial existence, where family or tribe gathered to dispel their boredom on cold winter evenings around the fire. What a romantic European anachronism! These naive descriptions of the existence in which the folk tradition in oral form grew, especially the use of a quantitative measure to describe the historical development of the creation from other cultures where a rich oral literary tradition existed, we know that even lengthy lyrical and prose works were transmitted from mouth to ear. From later literature, we know of many important written works whose quantitative scope is minimal. In short, there's no basis for the main distinction that assumes a change in Israel from one period where only short stories could be told, to another where suddenly longer stories could be tolerated. Nor is the main assumption that Israel's national memories and religious and ideological foundations were all the product of boredom on cold winter evenings around the fire. Even if we analyze the literary habits of recent generations, we find the opposite of the statement that, over time, they learned to appreciate longer legends. 19th century fine literature consisted of thick volumes and multi-volume works. The 20th century still produced significant works to some extent, and today, works are mainly of average length. In the internet age, it's not recommended to publish an article exceeding 1,000 words. The main point Gunkel strives to prove at all costs, that the legends were independent and therefore were separate stories, is completely refuted by linguistic comparisons between all the stories of Genesis and between the stories of Genesis and Exodus. These prove that all stories were cast in one mold from the outset and were constructed around the idea of the deeds of the fathers being a sign for the children. See Genesis and Exodus as a planned unified entity, and also Exodus uses Genesis. The beginning of Israelite literature was in songs performed originally, as many writings testify, by a folk assembly that sang them to the music and accompanied by dances. His book. What do the writings testify? That there were assemblies, or that this was the beginning of Israeli literature? Following the facts that there's no Egyptian influence, there's the usual way of dealing with it. We find no Egyptian influence in the legends of Genesis, even though there likely was in the Joseph stories, without being able to prove it. And what about Canaanite influence? This merging of ancient Israel and New Canaan is the key to understanding the religion and literature of historical Israel. His book. Since this is the key, we would expect some evidence of Canaanite culture and its connection to Israelite religion. But all we get later in the article is the following gem. The primary attribution of Canaanite influence on Israel is the political writing, as we know that the structure of the Israelite state is a copy of the Canaanite kingdoms. Even the kings of Israel likely erected inscribed monuments similar to those of the kings of Moab and Aram. From where do we know that the structure of the Israelite state is a copy of the Canaanite kingdoms? While the opposite is true, the Canaanites, although one people or at least close tribes, operated in separate city-states. What does political writing have to do with it? Brought here as some data to be attributed to Canaanite political writing. And of course, the speculative conclusion about monuments of the kings of Israel is baseless. Their culture was different, and they did not erect monuments. These motifs prove the borrowing of legends. According to Gunkel, the motif of a ladder reaching heaven, brothers murdering each other, a dying man prophesying, the hero being taken from the world. The persecution of the younger and arrogant brother is a very common story. These are not motifs that naturally arise everywhere. Of course, these are vague and trivial examples. Does the story of brothers murdering each other really need to be borrowed from distant Babylon? He turns the story of Enoch into the hero, thereby lending a motif not found in the Torah to prove the Torah borrowed it from Babylon. No wonder he looked for donkeys and found a kingdom. It's simply obvious to him that Sarah and Milcah were figures of the city goddess of Haran, a bizarre opinion that found no support, as Wiseman also remarks. The dream of Joseph about the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars bowing down to him was originally a vision of the ruler of the heavens and the mighty forces of nature submissive to him. Of course, there's no doubt. All that's missing is the discussion, or at least a hint, in the modest realm of what's commonly referred to in research fields as evidence, forward and backward are determined by matter-of-fact arguments. The covenant story in chapter 15 is a newer creation with no ancient tradition. How do we know? We feel it in the fingertips, which doesn't prevent him from determining elsewhere. The appearance of God in fire and smoke is characteristic of the most ancient perception. And also, sections considered later, like chapter 15 or the story of the birth of Jacob's sons, contain the most ancient religious motifs. And what about general criteria for dating? That's easy. The older stories naively mix secular and religious motifs. The story of Abraham in Egypt simultaneously praises the ancient father's wisdom, the mother's beauty, and God's fidelity. The flood story also praises Noah's righteousness. The origin of these stories is somewhere in a period where the secular and divine coexisted harmoniously, when the children of Israel fought for the God of Israel and its heroes as one, the sword for the Lord, and for Gideon, Judges 7:20. So far, it's enough to date. The phrase, the sword for the Lord and for Gideon, which Gunkel apparently knows exactly when was written, sets everything. The period when the secular lived with the divine and peace upon Israel. Any reader of the Torah knows this is complete nonsense. David's beauty is described along with all his other deeds. Solomon's wisdom and his political success are described alongside his prophecies and righteousness, etc. And because the flood story praises Noah's righteousness, there's the secular with the divine. And no prophets praise the righteousness of prophets or other people. The later period no longer accepted the mixing of secular and religious motifs. This period, therefore, created distinctly religious stories about God and his deeds alone. But there's no book or story that deals only with the deeds of God, unless we use scissors. A secular-only father story is the story of Abraham and Lot's separation. Of course, this is nonsense. Lot's departure from the east, hinting at the departure of the people of the tower from the east, talks about Lot leaving Abraham's path, and it's a prelude to the Sodom story, and of course, a continuation of Abraham's family story before it. Throughout his writings, he judges the biblical content as childish, while the content is something he inserts into the text. For example, he expands to an unreasonable extent the etiology, the arbitrary assumption that different descriptions are not historical, but come fundamentally to answer questions, which of course are childish. For example, why are there so vast areas of land? This question is not written anywhere. Gunkel invents it, and indeed it is incorrect. Israel encountered vast lands in Egypt, in Babylon, but did not really encounter the wonderful lands of Japheth in Germany. Another huge question: why was Gilead decreed to serve as a border against the children of the East? Indeed, a harsh decree. Gilead serving as a border is a reasonable phenomenon and does not require any story. With a tone of condescension, he concludes, "These explanations seem childish to us, and the people of the ancient period were not capable of finding the real reason for occurrences. It's unclear why the people of the period couldn't understand what happened close to their time. It's not about very complicated matters. The perception in the Torah that God revealed himself as El, and only later with defined names, is very childish. It's not acceptable that the history of religion begins with the abstract and then comes to the details. It's not acceptable where? In Germany? What's childish here?" From his perspective, primitive thinking is inherently limited. The approach of the legends is not capable of capturing and encompassing many character traits of one personality, certainly not all of them. The intellectual limitation. The simplicity of the character traits described proves that the art of these folk legends is far from recognizing changes in character traits, whether for better or worse. And if modern interpreters seem to discover something different in the book of Genesis, it turned out to have been inserted at a later period. Of course, he preemptively provides a remedy to the criticism in his usual manner. Why doesn't the Torah describe emotions? The narrator is incapable of translating these internal processes into clear words. The narrator does not believe that the soul's life of a person is at the forefront of art. In his somewhat childish approach, he emphasizes solid and external facts. Even if we take into account that the secrets of nature were sealed for the ancient narrator, still, our contemporary narrator would not ignore the description of the Garden of Eden. For further details and to continue accessing the full article, please visit the link below.